Good evening. James and I are thrilled to be here at NACIS for the first time. I remember being at Geographic and my colleagues from the Cartographic division coming back from NACIS, and they were always fired up and would do a presentation of some of the things they'd learned and the things they'd seen, and it's wonderful to be able to come here and see what they saw. It's going to be a good week. In this room tonight, we have experts on maritime maps, military maps, factual maps, fictional maps, mobile maps, maps on automobiles, maps as business, maps as art, maps as incendiary devices. But before we do anything else, we'd like to thank Fritz and Ginny, Nick, the rest of their team for putting together such a varied and fascinating program for us. So. We'd also like to thank the awards committee for this tremendous honor. When they notified us last November, James and I were shocked. As two independent map makers, we were shocked that they spotted us amidst this great sea of talent, and all the talent that's out there in the world. It is with the utmost gratitude that we accepted their invitation to speak with you tonight. Now, to prepare our remarks, we decided to learn more about Corlis Benefideo. Nick filled you in a little bit, and I would like to echo that in saying that he was this mysterious cartographer in Barry Lopez's short story, The Mappist, who heroically clings to his principles to the chagrin of his employers, his cartographic principles. And it's an honor to receive an award named after such a fictional man, as James said to me, the Santa Claus of the cartographic community. I also must say how happy it makes me that you've created an award to celebrate imagination. Serious imagination. Often in the super serious world of adults, imagination is relegated to the realm of children, as if we've outgrown its utility. And I couldn't disagree more. Imagination can be a way in. For you, the cartographers, an imaginative approach can clear a path into a particularly thorny data set. For your readers, it can open a door to understanding, suggesting what the map is about before they even read a single word of text. But what does it mean to be imaginative? If you agree with the Oxford English Dictionary that says it means having or showing creativity, then we also need to define creativity. And for me, creativity has always been an exercise in surprise. It's about making unexpected connections, unexpected conversions. This is like that. This becomes that. For example, what if we took some data on life satisfaction, sense of purpose, happiness, and anxiety, and converted each metric into a different facial attribute? So maybe for life satisfaction, we could do this sort of mental fog for low life satisfaction, maybe a sunny glow if it's high. For sense of purpose, some pained eyes. If it's on the low end, like it was in Islington in London. Happiness, from a big smile to a frown. And anxiety, no to a lot of sweat drops flying off ahead. Now, what if we combined all those symbols and applied this conversion to all 33 of London's boroughs? Numbers become faces, become a map. Another conversion. To compare Londoners who apply for British passports with those who retain their foreign passports, stats become passport stamps, become a map. Here we're showing larger stamps that show Londoners that hail from Africa and South Asia as more likely to apply for citizenship. Compare that with this map where we're showing that the larger stamps in, say, the EU states in blue tend to keep their original documents because they can live and work in the UK without changing their citizenship. To be imaginative, then, to make unexpected connections, you need to maintain a deep visual inventory of things to connect. I call this keeping the well full. I go to art museums. If you get a chance this week, the Chrysler Art Museum here in Norfolk, as I've learned it's pronounced, is exceptional. They've just got an incredible display of artifacts, paintings, furniture, sculpture, tapestries. I go to art museums, travel, read, fantastic bookshop next door, prints books. I encourage you to go. I've been to a lot of bookshops. This one is a gem with really, really nice people working it. Everywhere you look, there's something I wanted to buy. A window shop, I browse historical atlases, I browse interior design catalogs, you name it. You never know when a visual reference is going to come in handy. So I'm always looking. The idea for this map, showing how you could visit all 270 of London's tube stations in a single day, it's called the Tube Challenge. This is actually depicting a recent record route. I think it was around 16 and a half hours it took to make this journey. We got this idea while looking at a piece of art that was hanging as a public arts project in the Russell Square tube station. Ideas come from everywhere. For another graphic, we had a list of haunted locations around London that we wanted to map. So I said, okay, brain, what's something visual and modular that also involves ghosts? Now, this map actually resulted in a correspondence with the Pac-Man permissions team at Namco in Japan. We sent them a draft of it, and they wrote back with some detailed style notes. One in particular, the pretzel and pear cannot be used. Please find the available items in the style guide, such as apple and strawberry. So we took their notes into consideration, we changed it up, and sent them back a new draft. And that earned us this response, which said, stems of apple and cherry have to be brown. Please refer to the design guide for the exact color. I took this as a good reminder that even when you're being imaginative, details matter. They're what make a metaphor convincing. I did not always have the courage to make such imaginative leaps, at least not with cartography. I can still recall one of the first map meetings that I attended as an entry-level designer at National Geographic. Senior design editors, photo editors, text editors, researchers, and some of the top cartographers in the world were all huddled around a map of Phoenicia. I noticed an opportunity to use color to link some labels and arrows together, but I was just a 23-year-old, fresh out of school. Who was I to speak up? I studied fine arts, not geography. For most of my life, maps were prompts for my imagination, not products of it. The earliest was a wooden puzzle of the 50 United States, and assembling those colored pieces over and over as a child induced a lasting synesthesia. To this day, when I imagine a state, I see it as the color it was on that puzzle. California is lime, Michigan is sky blue. Memory of those shapes proved useful many years later at a pitch meeting at the magazine. The story team was marveling at a video in which Senator Al Franken drew a map of the US from memory. Now, to me, and perhaps for many of you in this room, this was not such a big deal. I can do that, I said. I was not believed. A pen and a napkin were fetched, and I proceeded to replicate the wooden puzzle forever engraved in my mind. This is a napkin from Caribou Coffee at 17th and L in Washington, D.C. My colleagues found this demonstration remarkable enough to put in the magazine. To me, what was remarkable was that they could not see what I saw. I say this because it's a point worth emphasizing. Differences in how we see the world are what make the world interesting. They're also what make our work interesting. These differences arise from our range of life experiences, where we're from, where we've gone, what we've read, what we like, who we love, even those unfortunate circumstances that have happened to us. But in our professional lives, in companies and universities and newsrooms, differences can be discouraged in favor of the way we do things around here. I submit that it is precisely these imaginative differences that we must get into our work. Now, a few months after the napkin map, the magazine was preparing a special issue on the world's water crisis. A story was proposed on an EPA study that had found trace amounts of pharmaceuticals in fish in watersheds around the country. I was asked if I had an idea of how we might visualize it. Easy, I said. We'll make a fish out of pills. I had begun to trust my imaginative instincts. And when those instincts told me to leave the magazine, to rent a small house in Michigan, and to start making books with a geographer in London named James, I listened.
For me, it wasn't just fond memories of maps. It was collecting what I've come to know as spatial data. I remember being obsessed over mapping technology, specifically this one watch. It was the Casio Pathfinder. It had a compass in it, a barometer, an altimeter, and it had enough memory to store 12 hours of temperature and altitude data. On family hiking holidays, I'd be giving continuous updates on the fall of temperature due to the environmental lapse rate as we walked uphill. If that wasn't bad enough, my parents and brother needed to wait whilst I recalibrated the barometric altimeter every time we set off each morning. From moving weather fronts to human migration, I've always wanted to know how the world worked and how we could navigate through it. Geography was the subject for me, but I think my passion for maps came quite late. Even as an undergraduate, I didn't set out to make them. I was driven by analyzing and collecting spatial data. My first real passion for this came from glaciology and mapping the shrinking glaciers in Iceland and Alaska. But then I hit a stumbling block. Glaciology quickly becomes physics, and I'm no good at physics. But the methods I used in my fieldwork, such as geostatistics, gave me a framework of conceptualizing the world through data points. They'd also shown me that maps can bring mountains alive. So with an itch for map making and still no real clue about physics, I was drawn towards GIS and population mapping. I cannot say why I took that fork in the road, but it was the best decision I made. For one, it led Oliver and I to cross paths. His world of design and my world of mapping first united in 2010 when he was still at National Geographic. I was studying for a PhD that focused on mapping millions of surnames in Europe and beyond. And Oliver and his team at National Geographic contacted me out of the blue to ask if I could help producing a map of the most popular surnames in the US. When this map was nominated for an award in London in September 2012, Oliver flew over and stopped by my office to say hello. The success of the surnames map had got me thinking that what if we took all the data we could find on things like happiness, house prices, art, violent crime, and life expectancy, and so on and so on. And what if we created a visual guide to London, which is my home city, for the 21st century? That became London, the information capital. And that really captured a moment in the city's history. It was still on a high from the Olympics. The UK had just conducted the most detailed census to date. And more of its data sets were being released. And maps had become more popular than ever thanks to sharing on the internet, but also a number of hugely successful exhibitions, particularly hosted by the British Library. We now realize that we were just starting to see the power of maps when combined with the promise of big and open data. Since the book was published in 2014, we have seen tremendous progress in this space, to the point where cartography can sometimes seem like an arms race to map the world quicker and in more detail than ever before. To keep up, it helps to have a collaborator. In many researcher and designer relationships, however, the designer comes in at the end. For Oliver and me, the map-making process is an equal partnership from conception to the final map. When we find a promising data set or topic, typically we'll start by discussing the editorial angle we want to take and the possible projections or visual metaphors that we could use that would help frame the story that we're trying to tell. I'll produce initial exports. Oliver will then test the crops and color palettes, and then I'll re-export the data accordingly. It's a constant back and forth between us. For example, this graphic shows the origin and destination flows of commuters in southern England. It's based on 2011 census data. Now, I use this stats package called R for many of my visualizations. And using that, I drew this map here using slightly transparent white lines joining from where people live to where they work. And I thought this export looked pretty good on black. But then we imported it into Illustrator, and Oliver applied his labels and a series of additional transparency effects to make the lines glow. And you can see instantly it makes a big difference in terms of the style that the map conveys. And what's so interesting about this map and why it's one of my favorites from the book is that it was produced pretty quickly using the command line tools from R and then the pre-planned design work with Oliver. Another one of my favorite graphics in the book that kind of captures our relationship shows the number of pieces of work by each artist in the Tate galleries. And this started life as a kind of a basic tree map where you expand a series of rectangles based on the number of artworks that the Tate holds. And you can instantly see here that there's one artist in particular that has a very large rectangle and then lots of others with the slightly smaller ones. Oliver then painstakingly took this, broke it to bits, and transformed the squares into picture frames and sculptures, arranging them salon-style as a gallery. So you can see that Turner is the artist with by far the most works in the Tate, so we licensed one of his paintings to fill the biggest box. And so what could have been an uninspiring collection of boxes is instantly brought alive by the reader. Or for the reader, I should say, sorry. For our second book, Where the Animals Go, our collaboration expanded to include scientists all over the globe who were using technology to track movements of animals in amazing detail. This experience, working with scientists, taught me that it's not fair to expect everyone who creates or analyzes spatial data to be cartographers. Many scientists create maps with academic publications in mind and then move on without giving them a second glance. Others are nervous of sharing data with those outside their field for fear that their work will be misrepresented or used without credit. We may disagree with these perspectives, but they persist. So Oliver and I see one element of our work as being able to work with these people with such concerns to bring their research to a broader audience. And working together as a geographer and a designer, we help scientists find and show narratives in their data. Perhaps counterintuitively, this is mostly an exercise in data reduction. We're both fond of saying that a large part of our job is cleaning hairballs. Take, for example, this story of Rudolph, a seal in the Southern Ocean. This map shows the tracks of seals from data collected from tags deployed on them around Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. Now, these tags are actually deployed by oceanographers as well as zoologists because they're able to collect information about the salinity and the temperature of the water that the seals are passing through. And these animals are essentially acting like sentinels for our oceans. Now, this is the kind of export, the kind of graphic you may well see in an academic publication. Its initial impression is one of an abundance of data. A huge amount is going on here. There's a big tangle of lines. But once you get past that impression, you can't get much further with it. You couldn't tell me which one of those lines was the longest, or where the particular colonies of the seals were, or anything like that, because it gets lost in the tangle. And this kind of problem, or this way of thinking, was really brought home to me when I sent this initial export, as it was, to Oliver, who put it in an early layout and design for the book. And you can see here that his immediate reaction was to strip back a lot of that complexity by graying out many of those lines and giving us a focus on a single orange line. In this case, this was an illustrative line that he'd drawn that could tell us the story of a single individual seal. And that would give people a chance to kind of get their eye in to what's going on. And so the seal we chose was a seal named Rudolph. And he's perhaps one of the most famous seals that's tracked, because all graduate students who are starting work on this data from the University of Edinburgh, they start with Rudolph and the data that he's collected. And we showed his single track, his journey south towards the Antarctic Peninsula, the couple of months he spends hauled out on ice, feeding on squid, fattening up, and then his journey across the Drake Passage back towards the Falkland Islands, where he looks to breed, and then his tag eventually drops off where his last known location is. Now, already we can begin to look at this map in more detail, and we can ask ourselves more questions about what Rudolph is doing, what's his behavior, and so on. And it got us thinking, well, there's actually not enough here to answer some of those questions. So we put a lot of effort into collecting bathymetric data, so the terrain of the sea floor, using field contours and hill shading to show the depths and the ruggedness of the ocean that Rudolph was swimming over. And you'll see, too, that that hairball has still made it into the final graphic, but it's shrunk down, so it's a much smaller size than the previous version I showed you, colored by simply the colonies of the seals, and it adds a nice kind of inset locator map for the story. And what's more, we've just taken one track from that initial hairball. It didn't just fill one spread, but it filled two spreads in the book. We gave Rudolph a second double page to show the data that his tag was able to collect as he just swam that short trip, that relatively short part of his very long journey across the Drake Passage. So this is the storytelling power of small data. If you think of a nature documentary like Planet Earth, you never hear about every gannet in the colony. You'll hear about one breeding pair who tell a broader story. And that's true if you think of Barry Lopez's story. It would have been insufferable if, instead of hearing about the life of Corlis Benefideo, we had to slog through the biographies of every person in the town of Fargo. We find story in specificity, but specificity makes more work, more reporting, more analysis, and more time for us. In the Mappist, that sort of time-intensive mapping is what Benefideo longed for, what his employers loathed, and what drove him to strike out on his own. To make 1,651 hand-colored maps of North Dakota. Oliver and I share a reverence for such historic maps and methods. In fact, many historical maps can hold their own with most of the data-driven outputs we see today. So a couple of favorites from one transport atlas produced in France in 1892. You can see here the map is showing the number of travelers in red, the amount of revenue in yellow per class on Europe's railways. So the travel carriage class was first class, second class, third class. And you can instantly see or interrogate the map to tell you which citizens paid more to travel first class, in which country, and what percentage of revenue those different classes were generating. Typographically, the color palette, everything looks thoroughly modern. Likewise, this chart here maps the expansion of Europe's railways from 1830 to 1878. Blue circles indicate lengths of track added over time. Green and yellow quarter circles represent the amount of rail laid as a proportion of each country's population and its land area. Again, the way that the coastlines are demarked by the seas, shading, the choice of fonts, the choice of colors, wouldn't look out of place from a computer-generated map of today. So working together, as geographer and designer, we're able to combine cartographic details and typographic hallmarks of the past with the computer power of today. And so in our London book, we picked out Charles Booth's poverty map. This is a very famous example, one of the most detailed door-to-door street maps ever produced for the city. In this case, Booth employed policemen and school inspectors and others to walk the streets and to classify the status of the people that were living in each household. And but by modern standards, some of the classifications are quite crude. The poorest in society were labeled vicious and semi-criminal. But the map, the geography that it showed has persisted for a century or more. And we wanted to demonstrate this through the use of transparencies in a way that perhaps Benefideo might have done, by overlaying today's poverty map on booths. And so our readers can flick from one to the other and see what's going on. But working together, geographer and designer, we're also able to imagine new roles for base maps. Thanks to a range of Earth observation data now available, base maps no longer just have to be background context. They can become part of the story. So, for example, wind data, I expect all of you would have seen this map of modeled and recorded wind data with wind vectors shown as sort of tails, wisps passing over the ocean. We took this as inspiration to produce a wind map of the Southern Ocean and Antarctica here. You can see Antarctica in the center with the cold air falling off the frozen mass, and then the Southern Ocean winds whipping round the continent. And this is a crucial part of the story of albatrosses that encircle the continent. So here we show some data from tagged albatrosses, and we wanted to demonstrate how on their sabbatical year, particularly male albatrosses, they take a year off or 2 years off from breeding, and they do laps of the continent. And the wind data is important context for that. You know, an albatross doesn't really care where the roads are. It wants to know where the tailwinds are. And on this zoom of the map, you can see that there's a red track there and a kind of a greeny, turquoisey track. The red track is an albatross that does its double lap. The green track shows the extent or the distance that an albatross could travel from its breeding colony to these Kerguelen Islands and still make it back again, fighting those headwinds. My final example of this is the maps we've produced of snowy owl data. Now, these snowy owls were part of an eruption of owls around the Great Lakes region, and they were traveling way further south than you may expect to find them. And so a group of volunteers in a project called Project Snowstorm put trackers on these owls and soon discovered that over the course of the winter they were spending a lot of time over frozen lakes. Now, for our base map, we wanted to show the lakes as they were at around the time that the owls were there. So this is a MODIS image taken during the winter that the owls were present, and you can see which lakes were frozen, which lakes were open water. And then you could take an image such as that of Landsat, in this case, that was taken, the week that the owls were in the area, where you could isolate the exact pieces of ice or blocks of ice that the owls were residing on, and using as a base platform to hunt the waterfowl that they were feeding on. This behavior had never been recorded before with these animals, and it was only really through linking together the blocks of ice where the birds were kind of basing themselves, and the GPS tracking data that were able to bring this story to the book. And it was actually the biggest data in the animals book was actually produced from these base maps. Last week I was frantically trying to free up space on my laptop, and I discovered that I'd saved over 200 gigabytes of imagery and terrain for about 50 graphics. Most of this didn't make it to print, but as we've learned, it's part of the process. You can download the data, you can work with it, you can crop it out, and a subset makes it to the graphic. So with each map, with each book, you'd think our process would get easier. I mean, in some ways it has. What once took us a week, we could probably now bash out in an hour or so. Part of this is thanks to new software, but part of this is thanks to experience. But actually, most is due to the fluency that we've developed by working together.
Aspiring authors, perhaps there's some in the room, are often told to write the book you want to read. For cartographers, the advice could be make the map you want to frame. As James and I were working on London, we began to imagine a new type of book, one that we had always wanted but had never really seen. Cartography books tended to fall into a few categories. There were instructional books that advised how to pick the appropriate projection or visualization technique. There were anthologies that gathered stellar examples from the past or best practices from the present. There were gift books that treated maps as jokes or one-off concepts. And there were, of course, atlases. What we hadn't seen were collections of original maps designed to comment on the world we live in now. What if, we wondered? What if we took a step back and used maps to reflect upon the larger patterns? To us, the distinction was like the difference between a news article and an essay, and we need both. In writing and photography, we get both. The previous recipient of this award, Rebecca Solnit, assembles each one of her essay collections as an ensemble. Top photojournalists build a point of view through photo essays, not single shots. Where, we wondered, was an equivalent for cartography. With London, the information capital, and Where the Animals Go, we aim to build a case through a series of data essays. In London, it was a case for what data can reveal about life in the 21st century. For animals, what data can tell us now about the natural world. In both, we tried to take the long view, to put the present in the context of history while also looking towards the future. James and I are now at work on a new book. We've gathered data, designed spreads, written stories, but we're still going back and forth on the book's title because one of the nagging questions we continue to revisit throughout our process is, what are we trying to say? What's our point of view? What is the sum of 100 maps? Originally, our publisher commissioned our London book under the working title, London Infographics. In a way, that's a perfect example of how many editorial desks think of maps and graphics, as these singular things about a subject. A map of London, a chart of population over time. Or as the narrator of the Mappist modestly described his own achievements, some illustrations, however well done. After James and I had produced a few dozen such illustrations, we realized that the whole was communicating something more than its parts. We realized that this collection of data pulled from public data stores and open data policies at the national and city level would not be possible in any other city at that time. So the sum of 100 maps became not London Infographics, but London the Information Capital. The maps themselves were making an argument for open data, for London as an example for the rest of the world, for the power of maps and map makers to help inform policy and to improve our lives. Flip through a magazine, scroll through a site, and you'll often see the map as the accompaniment, a complementary figure that helps elucidate the main story. James and I, we believe that maps can be the main story. We believe that you, the cartographers, can be the lead. You have a voice on par with writers and photographers. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You have the power to make patterns visible. You have the power to show the change we see in this world. You have the power to warn, to reveal, to defend, to delight, to connect, to direct, to focus, to fascinate. You have the power to fire the imagination of a generation just like the City of Ascensions did for Philip Trevino in The Mappist, just like those wooden puzzles and Casio Pathfinders did for us decades ago. You never know who will be looking at your maps. What young kid is going to look at them and want to make something like that one day? At the end of The Mappist, Corlis Benefideo says the real question is, now, what will you do? It's a good one. What will you do? You invited us here today to talk, perhaps make a few suggestions. So I'll leave you with 3. To power your imagination, trust your instincts, and keep the well full. This week, you got an opportunity to go to some sessions on subjects you know nothing about. To take your maps to the next level, find a collaborator. This room undoubtedly is full of them. And to find your voice, perhaps we could take a cue from Mr. Benefideo himself. You don't have to retreat to North Dakota or Michigan, but allow yourself time to push an idea as far as it will go. If there's a subject you're passionate about, don't stop with a single map. Make a lot of maps. Maybe not 1,651, but enough to hear what they're starting to say. Because you, the mappists, have a voice, and we want to hear it. Thank you.
Time for questions?
We are happy to answer any questions. We are also happy to sit down if you want to get on with the reception. So, to the reception it is. All right. Well, there's one back there.
I would love to hear some feedback from the scientists that you work with in terms of how they receive the work you do. Because certainly, I look at it as truly an age, but do they felt the work was justified? Or that you mentioned revealing new things?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think that I kind of characterize them in different ways. So there's some people who are just brilliant at sharing data and really understand the data they've collected and are happy to share it. And some were just like, yeah, take it, do what you want. I don't mind how it looks and how it comes back. Some were genuinely interested in the process and would, one of the things that took longer than we expected in the animals book was the iterations we may have to go through. So it may be that we read an academic publication that told a particular story about the data that had been collected. Oliver and I visualized it, took it back to the researcher, and then they're like, oh, hang on a minute, there's this much more interesting thing happening here. Why don't you focus on that or something like that? So there was more of that kind of iterative process with them. Some just told us to get lost, and subsequently regretted it when the book came out, which was great. And then some were much more, we've done this the best way possible. You're not going to be able to visualize this any other way. And that, again, was kind of I didn't see that as them being particularly obstructive, but it was just a kind of more an educational process for them about how you can take things that step further. And I think having the relationship such as we are, me being an academic myself, it was a bit more disarming for them because they realized that I had similar things at stake that they do if it all goes wrong.
No one trusts me at
Yeah.
the beginning.
Yeah, I'm the intermediary. Trying.
Yeah, so that's my personal challenge, is to make them regret not trusting me. And when they see it, they go, oh, well, he kind of knew what he was talking about. Save the Elephants was a good example. I got an opportunity to go to Kenya and work with Ian Douglas Hamilton and Frank Pope and their team, and go out and you meet some of the elephants and go on a collaring expedition and just see how the whole process works. And Ian loves maps. I mean, it's a toss-up between elephants and maps, which he loves more, and he was so eager to see what he could do with his data. And we found that there were a lot of scientists who had that openness and are fully cognizant of the fact that their focus is on conservation and studying the animals and protecting the species and collecting the data, and they don't have the resources to, they can do, I mean, Save the Elephants does some incredible mapping. Jake Wall does some incredible stuff, you know, using the accelerometer data and elephant speed, but they are, their number one priority is conservation, and they're using their maps for conservation. But if they get an offer to team up with people who want to take that data and make some more maps and get the word out about the plight of the elephants, they're really open to collaboration. And there's so many scientists that we talked to who said, we need cartographers, we need designers, we need spatial analysts, we need engineers, we need coders, we need people who care about these animals and want to use their talents to help tell these stories. So if there is a particular species or scientists who study you, read about, that interests you, reach out. You know, they may be very open to working with you.
What you said is so true. My last job was at the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and my current job is at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And both jobs are about gathering data. Well, my job at both jobs was about gathering data and telling the stories of people and the environment that need help. At my last job, though, for international data especially, it was really hard to gather a set of data. What would you recommend to people who aren't professors and people who have access to larger networks of people who create data? Because a lot of that data is hidden away and tucked away and on people's external hard drives or just on paper and not really any accessible means.
Yeah, so the question for those who couldn't hear it, and the guys, if anyone out there watching on the live stream, was essentially what would we recommend, I think, to find data, but also facilitate data sharing with people that collect these data sets. I've found, basically with the animals book, it tended to be me getting the raw data and doing some stuff with it, working with Oliver on the concept, and then working through the design and so on. I try to make it as easy as possible for people to share the data with me, so I don't specify any data formats or anything like that. The downside to that is depends downside and upside. The downside at the time was I had to learn a lot about lots of different data formats. The upside now is I now know a lot about lots of different data formats. But I think the animals book took maybe, I think I counted like 10 different data formats and 6 different software packages I needed to use just to get it into a way that we could map it. I would reach out and seek people who are already doing this kind of stuff and very good at it. So, for example, the animals data, there's a thing called MoveBank, where there's a big initiative run out of a Max Planck Institute for Ornithology, where scientists are uploading their data in a consistent format that's spatially referenced and that can be downloaded and used. I find that the people who are most reluctant to share data tend to be the ones that don't understand it that well. And I think they're a bit scared of perhaps revealing something they don't realize, or not understanding how the data works, you know. And so I tend to have a policy where I ask someone 3 times, and if they don't help me the 3rd time, I just move on to the next person, because I'm not going to go much further with them, I think. So.
The 2 of you obviously are a remarkable team. How does a geographer in London meet and collaborate with a designer in Michigan? How did that happen?
James touched on, the surnames map that we produced together that led me over to London, where we met over coffee for the first time. But as far as like how we work on the books, I mean, I probably on the London book spent a total of 2 weeks in London, just doing some field trips and doing some things that I needed to see for myself. But yeah, it's just video conferencing, internet, Dropbox. The benefit of it actually is that we have a 24-hour-a-day factory going. So, I punch out, send him an email with my crude drafts of where I've gotten, go to sleep. When I wake up, he's taking it the next step further, and so it goes. And, when it's really going smoothly, the production never stops. And then when we're both in a funk, it's just...
Yeah, when it goes badly,
when it
we're
goes bad, it goes
both
real
up
bad.
24 hours. Yeah. Oh, there's a few. Let's go with that question. Someone tell us when to stop for time reasons.
So my question is, as cartographers, are some of the impulses to display all the data, show it all, right? And
Resist that.
fairly insistent about that, telling a narrative story or highlighting one story out of all of this data, backgrounding some of it and foregrounding some of it is good narrative choice. I guess my question is professionally, what is the ratio between display all the data and we have so much data we have to foreground one story to really illustrate something, a narrative about the larger data set. So what's the ratio between that? And then also, is there a third choice there that perhaps you didn't touch on or that I've missed in watching your thoughts?
So the question was really, what's the ratio between, essentially, I think, where do you draw the line between showing all the data or just taking a sample out of the data and extracting a key story or something like that from it? Well, you probably best answer that.
Yeah, I think I'd just start off with, who's it for? And what are your goals, right? If you're showing to an audience that's conversant in big data and it would be really impressive to show what you've been able to do, then yeah, I guess throw the hairball at them. That's what happens in a lot of scientific journals because people can speak that language, they're conversant in it. But if you're trying, like we were, or in a lot of mass media publications, you're trying to reach a lay reader who might not know anything about seals or big data or mapping, it's going to be this barrier that they just can't get across. And so we try and extend a hand out to the reader and allow them a way in. That's where the metaphors, the imaginative metaphors come in. That's where the data reduction comes in, and that's where the power of story comes in. My wife is a filmmaker, and she's inspired by novels. She grew up reading, and all the books that she reads informs the films and documentaries she likes to make. And she's the first person to be my critic on story. When I show her some cool map that I made, she goes like, "Well, that's great, but what's the story?" It can't just. For me, the bar is it can't just be patterns. It just can't be patterns you throw out there. There has to be a clear takeaway you want your readers to have.
And just a crucial consideration is to think of it as a data problem as much as a design problem. So I think if you do the data reduction, if I did that export with the whole hairball and sent it to Oliver to clean up in Illustrator, that would be a pretty hard job for him to do, but also you'd be missing a lot of information that perhaps could have been included if you'd done something on the data first, if you clustered the lines together, if you'd done some kind of subsetting in the data set. So that, I think, is where we talk about us working sort of collaboratively on an equal footing. I think that's where one of the challenges as a designer or cartographer comes in, is if you've got an academic who's just spewing stuff at you that you then have to then fit to some kind of publication format or layout, you can do a very good job, but it's not quite as good as being able to go back and clean the data and simplify the lines and all that kind of stuff, and then re-export it. So, one final,
We got Alex and Martin.
yeah. Okay.
I'm very interested in your process now that there's two of you as collaborators. Oliver, I know you came from National Geographic where you know a lot of collaborators on every project. How do you sort of balance the need to trust your instincts and know what you want to be able to do working with the scientists versus, you know, getting input from other people, from your wife on story, or how do you strike that balance? Because I think you need to get input, but you need to trust your instincts as well and do complete the vision that you've had for what you want to do. And then just a teeny side question. You say you make a lot of maps. Did you make more than 50 or did you have to drop some?
So the question was about process and how how we collaborate with one another, but how also we seek input from others. And then the small question was editorial about whether we made more than 50 maps and dropped some at the end.
The small question first is, you know, there were more than 100 maps for London, and we cut the dogs that just weren't up to it. With animals, you know, there was the same process, and it's really frustrating, especially in the early going, because the first maps in a project like this always take the longest, and by the end you've like really figured out all the styles, and you're just pulling pieces in color palettes that you've made elsewhere, and they can come together much quicker. And when one of the ones that you've like labored on in the beginning for 2 months just has to go, it's really always the right move, but not any less painful. How do we find the balance? I mean, I feel really lucky to have found a collaborator that I don't know, just get along with and inherently trust. If he tells me, you know, an idea of mine is utter shit, I mean, I have to respect that.
Do you even go outside the two of you?
I mean, yeah, we reach out to our editors, but you know, ultimately our editors do tell us like it is your book, so we do trust ourselves.
Yeah, if we're honest, I think the way that we. Well, so it's interestingly, sometimes if our editors are very helpful, and our initial instinct is always to sort of clam up a bit, and then you give it a few days, and you think, oh, actually, yeah, they probably were right, or they had a point. But we have a very interesting cast of characters involved, because the editors we deal with are not cartography people at all. They're not even data or graphics people. They create books that are predominantly text. So that in itself is a refreshing perspective, because they're probably closer to the audience than, you know, we could hopefully easily sell books in this kind of room because everyone likes maps and gets them, but outside of this room it's hard to sell. So the feedbacks come from them. Yeah, we have kind of friends and family feedback, which actually is pretty invaluable because they tend to be honest with us. And then in terms of the collaborators, if anyone's supplied data for us, we see that as a collaborative approach, so we go back and forth with them. We don't tend to just impose something on someone.
But with a nod to Mr. Benefideo, I mean, it really does come down to just trusting your vision, because to even get this book proposal in front of our editors, even after the London book, we had to persuade our agent that it was worth doing, and he told us that nature books don't sell, and you shouldn't be doing a nature book. We should do a book about like the human body and make graphics about how much we sweat every day, and we were not interested in doing that. And you know, I was just still thinking about this graphic that I'd made with Jim McClellan and the team at National Geographic. I had helped with the watercolor background on a map about an elephant named Annie that was killed, and a GPS track of her movements revealed that, and working on that map to see the life of an individual animal just fundamentally changed me. And we had the opportunity to do a next book. I thought we could tell more stories like that, and it was unwavering from that vision. Oh.
We'll have one very quick question, and then we'll do this.
I know that about you. I don't know, James, but I think you really immerse yourself in these stories, and you do a lot of research, and you didn't talk about that very much. And I want to hear about that part of the process, because that to me is a really key part. And I'm wondering what else you do. You kind of split it up. James does the data, but some of the stories you tell me, I think you dig into the data a little bit as well. And I just want to hear sort of your
Oh, well, I mean, I'm the first to admit that I'm not going to be the guy in D3. Is that even what it's called? Is that R? And I come from a fine arts background. I'm much more hands-on. That's why I found a collaborator who can complement what I can do. You know, that first graphic I showed of the personal well-being in London and all the churn-off faces, and that was a small data set, 4 metrics for 33 boroughs, and I could have shown, I didn't, there's, you know, a printout that I made, and I went through with a pencil, and I just started finding the breaks in the data where I could divide up the different, you know, the range from a smile to a frown, and then started just doodling in the margins of, you know, what these facial features could look like, and pretty much that hand-drawn sketch of that printout of a single Excel spreadsheet, then I just translated into that. Yeah, I mean, it's not that glamorous. I pride myself on a lot of the reporting too, and so, you know, with Save the Elephants, going there and spending time with Ian Douglas Hamilton and having dinners and going out in the field and being able to take a lot of notes and then bring all that to bear in the interviews and go back into my notes months later, and then when I'm looking at the map, you bring all that contextual information of the story into the map, so it really is about telling the story. Trying to think of other examples, like, you know, there's one in the London book about the police helicopter, and, you know, 7 days in July when the helicopter catches criminals, and is, you know, this, we went through Twitter, right, and got all the tweets that were tagged with the London police helicopter's Twitter handle, and they put in descriptions of the call out that we're on, whether they were chasing a vehicle or chasing criminals, or if it was just taking photos of the city. And I printed this whole thing out and taped it together in multiple sheets and hung it, you know, out on my wall, and I just went through it with a pencil, line by line, and categorizing stuff, and then turned it into this graphic. And James helped me with the export after I sort of told him the vision of what I wanted, and then, you know, I did all the conversions in Illustrator. But
I think,
it's a very manual, unpleasant. Well, I find it really satisfying, but to other people it might be like, you know, like a caveman or something.
He's a bit weird in that respect. Actually.
I count a lot of boxes.
We have, and I think that, I would obsess over getting some computer code to do something clever.
I think in the time that he could take to figure out the code to generate it in 3 minutes, I could have stayed up for 18 hours and just like counted all the boxes.
And then we'll say, let's do it again tomorrow. And he's like, oh, it's another 18 hours, but at least I'll have the code. So that's the...
people say that all the time. Well, that would be time consuming. Like, sometimes it's not. It was just 3 hours on a coffee.
Yeah. But, you know, with 1 million rows in a spreadsheet, it doesn't always work like that. So I think that's the bit I enjoy, I think, that I'm being pushed into that way of thinking, but making things possible in data sets that you couldn't previously do anything manually with. I think that's kind of where we work. But on that note, we'll leave it there. Thanks.